I am glad to present to all of you Dr. Francisco Galindo from the National University of Mexico.
He is a veterinary graduated from the National University. He has a PhD in animal welfare and behavior in the United Kingdom, 1996. In 1995, he was designated the ethology head of department of the National University, and ever since then he has been teaching animal well-being and behavior to students, particularly in the postgraduate unit. He has been the coordinator of the Animal Welfare Committee and National Health in Mexico. Morning. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you for the invitation, particularly Dr. José Luis Pairo. I can't see him now, and the Mexican Cinephile Federation. Thank you for this initiative. I will have the opportunity of talking to you about the concept of animal welfare, the science behind animal welfare. It's important to do it because that's the way we can start using an objective science-based concept which we can use in legal documents and any other public policy or public documents. So for the benefit of foreign visitors, my slides are in English, but I will deliver this discussion in Spanish. So I will try and speak at the appropriate voice so that the message is conveyed. My presentation this is the outline of my presentation. I will speak about some of the background of this concept. Then I will talk about biological markers of animal welfare. And then I will put this in the context of the main topics about dog welfare and the agenda followed by the WOH in the past AW. There is a consensus that the interest to define the concept scientifically came after the publication of a book in 1964, yes, written by Ruth Harrison. She was a person deeply interested in knowing about the environment in which animals were being used and raised, particularly in production areas in Europe. She wrote another book called Animal Machines, obviously for production animals, but then it started having an impact on other kind of animals, particularly for protein production. She coined several terms, and 1 year after it was published, the United Kingdom government used it when they made the Bramble report, chaired by Dr. Bramble. He brought together many specialists dealing with veterinary science and animal science, and the summary of the Bramble report is the document we all know as the 5 freedoms. It is very important to give you the context of the 5 freedoms. 5 freedoms are a summary of a document revolving around the need to legislate for animal welfare, particularly production animals, and then it becomes a useful guide for all other animals. It does not define animal welfare, but it is a good background and guidelines for a group of animals. But impact was so high that it has resulted in the origins of principles and criteria used in evaluating animal welfare. This, as you can see on the screen, is what we call the 5 domains of animal welfare. It is a concept framework around which we have indicators and criteria to evaluate animal well-being. David Mellor from Massey University in New Zealand summarizes the 5 domains. And as you can see, it's basically taking the 5 freedoms, and instead of calling them freedoms, he speaks about principles. But there's an interesting thing here. And this includes mental state as a biological characteristic. Although the 5 freedoms document speaks about freedom, fear, and anger, as well as some negative mental states, David Mellor shapes it to include positive mental states And this is something that has remained the main challenge in animal science, to identify the indicators that will really reflect the mental state of animals. I want to emphasize, though, that one of the 5 freedoms is, as you can see, for animals to have an opportunity to express their natural behaviors. It was proposed as a part of the Bramble Committee. It was Dr. William Thorpe who expressed this, and he emphasized that animals have behaviors which are the biological needs, like all kinds of animals we interact or we use or serve the humankind. They have their own behavioral needs which need to be taken care of. Otherwise, we will be facing lots of health problems. It is not a coincidence. 1 year after the Bramble report, the scientific society, bringing together most scientists in animal welfare, came together. It was known as the Society for Veterinary Ethology. But in 1986, since there were many, it became the International Society for Applied Ethology. As I said before, it's a scientific society which brings together around 90% of researchers around the globe. And it has a journal, and it's one of the key, most quoted animal science journals. And of course, it includes lots of papers around dog welfare. There are other journals, but this one remains the most important. But why is it important to define this concept objectively? There is a very interesting article by Ian Duncan and David Fraser, Canadian, which deals with perception of animal well-being in general in the society. And they see this as effective resource. I mean, there are people in society who try to define animal welfare from the point of view of mental states. But there is another sector in people emphasizing on biological functioning from the body, like measuring parameters like health, production, in order to assess animal welfare. And there are some other people emphasizing the natural side of it. That is to say, an opportunity for animals to express the whole of their behaviors with a high level of adaptation. Those behaviors which were useful for survival of that particular species. And here we can have a conflict because at some point some people emphasize affective states without considering biological functions or the aspects of behavioral evolution. And sometimes it's a bit of a perception of what we believe is good for animals, but it may not be in the best interest of that welfare. On the other hand, there are people emphasizing biological functioning in terms of physiological variables, longevity, gaining body weight, prevalence of diseases, etc. But they don't emphasize much about evolution aspects of mental well-being, welfare, or welfare indicators which are not only related to biological parameters. And as I said before, there are some other people who prefer to emphasize natural behavior. But we know that if we leave animals in a place where they can express all behaviors, many of their welfare conditions might be compromised. So, in summary, basically there are different approaches, different perceptions. That means that we are assigning different weight to different approaches. And oftentimes, such perceptions are not the same. And by fulfilling one or the other condition does not necessarily mean we're fulfilling all other. That is why it is so important, and there's a consensus that we have to define this concept objectively and scientifically, staying away from cultural and social perceptions. So basically focusing on what animals need. And this question was posed by Dr. Dawkins from Oxford University when we questioned how to evaluate animal welfare. Is animal healthy? Is it okay? But there is another question. Is this really a good question. Does the animal do or have what they need? And for this, lots of work has been done using behavioral studies, physiology studies. And at this point, I would like to emphasize the point made by William Thorpe when he spoke about biological need, talking about behavior. When we speak about behavior, we need to integrate several aspects attributed to behavior. The causes of how an animal wants to do something at that moment, that is to say, behavior, also to change in their life. And this is called proximal causes, the concept of behavioral motivation. On the other hand, there are more of evolution concepts in biological evolution, emphasizing another concept, which is the adaptation value of behaviors. And this is basically behaviors which were biologically important. For example, for a dog to co-evolve with human beings. For example, getting to understand body language of human beings or interspecies communication. This is a biological aspect, and that's something dogs have been learning for thousands of years, and it was an adaptive value for them. There's another concept, inclusive skill, which emphasizes biology of behavior and evolution of behavior. And oftentimes in domestic animals, we tend to overlook this concept, so it is important to accommodate them. These are the basis, and then we can understand biological systems of environmental response, which we use in measuring animal welfare, or the domains by David Mellor. Mental state, as we said, is a biological characteristic. It is not anything God gave only to humans. No, animals, at least vertebrates, have this capacity, and this mental state are useful in order to change behavior when needed and change environment response in order to be able to face challenges. And the other ones which we use in measuring variables, physiology, stress and pain. What we cannot measure mental state of animals because it would be subjective. It would be a mental construction unique of one individual. Still, we can use some behavioral physiological indicators in order to help us assess animal state of an behavioral state of an animal. This is how we use them, using this environment response. And it is defined as a relative term. It is not absolute. I mean, it is not an absolute state of welfare. It does not exist. Welfare of an individual, including humans, means successfully facing constant challenges coming from environment changes. If an animal is able to overcome those challenges, it is positive. If not, it will be negative. So this concept emphasizes the relative aspects. This is the definition being used by OMSA, and it is based on Don Broom's concept back in the 80s in the UK. Emphasis is made on a qualitative scale using this quantitative data. So we're talking about positive well-being. If we see these behavioral indicators, normal behavioral indicators are biologically important. But if we see adrenal normal activity, immune response, normal immune response, reproductive response, or welfare, negative welfare, if we see exactly the opposite. So this qualitative scale allows us to assess the degree of welfare. So again, we emphasize the fact that animal welfare is objective. It is science-based. It is based on behavioral studies, epidemiological behavioral studies, and it refers to biological condition of animals, not what is given to animals. So the concept of animal welfare does include health. It is much wider than just health, and it should not be as a synonym of animal protection, because animal protection has to do with ethical obligations of humans towards animals. But animal welfare refers to biological conditions of animals. Having said this, and going directly into dog welfare, I'm not directly related to dogs. I work on conservation and sustainability, but I like to see how science has helped define public policies for different groups of animals. So we get back to Marian Dawkins' question. Is the dog healthy? Can we measure? Does the dog do or have what it needs? That is the basic questions we need to pose to ourselves. And then posing this question as related to the ways in which we interact with dogs, because not all dogs are pets or company animals. And then there are many ways in which an animal can be an company animal, an accompanying animal. And as you know, there are groups of animals, particularly dogs, which we use as accompanying dogs. Some other are used in biomedical research, work animals, and also exhibitions, which is quite an important topic for this Congress. But there are lots of dogs that are abandoned. And this all has a relation in the way of being able to design protocols for scientific evaluation in dogs. All of this will be useful in all types of interactions with them. So if we emphasize typology and characterization of accompanying animals, there is a classification from FAO, who are at home with animals, but some other are community animals. That is to say, animals living basically on the street, and they belong to a whole community, but nobody at the same time. But in the end of the day, those animals will not die surrounded by the family. These animals may be subject to bad treatment. Perhaps they might be run over by a car, etc. And there are lots of animals living in wild conditions, and this is something we need to take care of. This flow chart, I don't know if you can read this, but basically it summarizes the complexity to understand many of behavioral problems in accompanying dogs, which then result in being abandoned, because this is a complex subject. Development of behavior, ontogeny from motherly care, the way they are weaned, their relation with their mom, early socializing with people or other animals, and of course, the type of interaction with pet owners or the owners, and these sensitive stages of socializing. Then they are reflected in a behavior which shows if an animal has behavioral problems, and if there is not a specialist veterinary diagnostic, these animals end up abandoned. This chart summarizes the importance of what animals need in order to socialize with people at those critical stages. It was performed by Hennessy in 2020. They measured the impact of 20 sessions in 5 weeks in plasmatic cortisol. As you know, cortisol is connected with chronic stress. So adrenal activity is measured. And here you can see a clear difference, how by interacting with people becomes very important in order to mitigate the long adrenal activity. But why am I saying this is important? Because, as we said before, there are lots of behavioral problems resulting in abandonment and welfare. On one hand, we may have from a breeding center, we may encounter behavioral problems, and if they are not treated properly, this may result in behavioral problems at home, then abandonment. Following abandonment, we have lots of dogs on the street, and they may even become wild dogs. And what is the solution? Well, the solution is taking them to canine control centers, and in the best case scenario, they might be adopted again or sacrificed, and oftentimes they try to find the best ways. And then at shelters, behavior at shelters. Ideally, if there are good adoption programs, this is successful in order for dogs to get back to a home with people. But oftentimes, success of adoption programs is not too high. So we need to sit and wonder how we can take care of these behavioral problems, which come together at the end. And I relate it to behavioral problems in the stages of development. And so, the importance that we have problems connected with the way in which animals are handled, the shelter, and we know that some of the most important topics is taking care of behavior and welfare at kennels, and understand how we can use protocols in order to evaluate welfare of dogs at kennels. And this is particularly relevant because oftentimes this is the Isle of Cozumel. We did some work with an NGO, IFAO, to identify how dog populations in this island and in the island of Dominica may have an interesting interface. Dogs originally living at households, or then they move to other areas, they go to more rural areas. And here we see some other like small town. And then here we have the garbage dump of the island. 20% of the dogs in this place end up as wild dogs in the garbage dump. So this only goes to show how there can be an interface in different populations of dogs. Therefore, taking care of the problems might help us solve much of this exchange of individuals from population to population. Because we know in the end of the day that many of these behavioral and welfare challenges in dogs have something important to do with people. We have public health challenges, not only with passing on diseases, but also behavioral problems of dogs, environment. There are many wild dogs in some conservation areas, particularly that may endanger endemic species. And of course, welfare of dogs themselves, because as we said, these dogs are not controlled. They don't have their welfare guaranteed. What kind of factors would allow us to solve some of these problems? Education and training at all levels is one of them. Veterinary care, passing on this message to dog owners. It is very important to have the information of what kind of animal they take into their homes and the particular needs of them to have it accompanied by a veterinary doctor, and of course the regulatory framework in place for these problems. So this is how the World Organization for Animal Health is now taking care of the agenda. The WAH has emphasized on production animals because of health issues related to humans, but now they're working on other chapters having to do with accompanying animals and dogs. For those of you who are not familiar with the WAH, it's an intergovernmental organization bringing together 192 countries. It was founded in 1924, and it is the first intergovernmental organization. It came up even before FAO and the United Nations, and the WAH has set the basis for animal health and animal welfare. And since 2004, it included animal welfare as a part of its agenda, and since that year, they have been issuing recommendations to member states, which are meant to be followed by those states. I encourage you to check WOHA website and have a look at that to your particular country. We have to do education, legislation, and public policy. And WOHA is based in Paris. It is headed by Monique Lois, and it has collaboration centers. Our school was recognized as a collaboration center for animal welfare, and this has resulted in a very active agenda, particularly in Latin America, but throughout the hemisphere, because this is a collaboration center for the whole of the Americas, and it's accompanied by 3 other accompanying centers, collaborating centers. The first one was in Italy, then Sweden. This is a collaboration center for Europe. There is one in Australasia, including 4 universities, one in Australia and one in New Zealand, and we have this tripartite collaboration center, Chile, Uruguay, and Mexico, and the 4th one recently recognized in Washington, D.C., more focused on lab animals, but it also helps in the agenda for other animals. But why am I saying this? Because the role of a collaboration center is to support in pursuing the agenda of WOA, and this includes many of the subjects we discussed before: training, teaching, legislation. And when it comes to teaching, it is no new that WOA promotes inclusion of compulsory courses on animal welfare and ethology. In 2013, there was an international conference to propose a basic curriculum for veterinarians, establishing minimum guidelines and competencies, and it includes ethology and animal welfare. And I have to say, I'm very pleased to see Dr. Leopoldo Pash, who was the dean of our school, just at the time the Department of Ethology was proposed, and including ethology in the curriculum. 2003, that was 20 years before WOA proposed this, and it's interesting because it was the first veterinary medicine school including a compulsory course on animal welfare and ethology. So the idea here is not just thinking, how can I teach it in a cross-cutting manner, including courses here and there. The idea is to have a compulsory training course and with people well trained on this. And the first animal welfare professor was Don Broom, who visited our school in several occasions back when we were promoting the creation of ethology department, and our beloved Lina Lujan inviting Don Broom to come once he was designated animal welfare professor, together with Temple Randing, a great animal promoter and scientist, and other European scientists and researchers who helped us launch an agenda and gaining experience on how to teach animal welfare. And this has allowed us to interact with other working groups around the world. And there is a consensus that an animal welfare training course has to include these 3 topics: science, public policies, and bioethics. From my point of view, bioethics, and that's why it's not in bold, should be a separated course, because students may get mixed up between biology and ethics, but that's the way it is done, and it completes animal welfare teaching. I don't want to go too deep into the scientific component, but basically it would be about including, as a part of the syllabus, these basic concepts like the ones we have discussed about ethology, scientific evaluation, biological indicators of animal welfare, and the implementation of this in different groups of animals. It's important because it is not the same talking about accompanying animals as compared to production animals. The way you can evaluate them might be the same, but the way it is applied comes directly from the way we use those animals. We have also been part of efforts for a preschool education, and this is a pilot study with 𝐒𝐞𝐿 NGO. We have this teaching material for children. And think of this simple question in a witness group before using this. And boys and girls who were able to use this material in learning. So the base basically is, what do accompanying animals need in order to live well? Those who didn't get it would just say water and food. And children who had access to this thought of things like shelter, love, a family. So see how useful this could be to include this in early stages of education in order to improve the way we interact with animals in general. This is another question. Describe a basic aspect for an accompanying animal. Again, those who read the material include affection, vaccination, for example, curing them, healing them. That includes the importance of a veterinary doctor in the care of these animals. So this shows that a good educational effort in society would help us prevent many problems. For example, related to dog owners having a professional advice so that many problems can be avoided. That's why I mentioned the importance of vets, nutritional requirements, and consulting clinical ethologists when there is any of these problems. When it comes to breeding centers, to know exactly the way in which they can socialize in the early stages and with people, because this is going to prevent many challenges in the future. When it comes to research, this is just a list of what I believe. These are the trends in research for animal welfare. And in future, I'm sure we will see more and more, and they will be receiving funding for research. One is characterizing animal welfare challenges and developing the practical evaluation protocols for animals. They are in place for production animals, not for all, but for many. And I think that could be a good basis to design practical evaluation systems in dogs. The attempts have been made, but there are still some gaps in how to develop them. And of course, taking care of topics which we now have to do with breeds, stress and epidemiology studies, stress problems in animals result in disease. So we need to check animal welfare as a causing factor or an epidemiological one. This is important. Again, animal conditions, understanding how they communicate with people and how some cognition aspects do determine the success of the type of training or the types of activities for which animals are trained. If animal welfare is okay, it is appropriate, the success of those programs will be higher. And in closing, and I don't want to take any more of their time, this is very important, particularly for Mexico, because we have been lobbying for animal welfare framework. We haven't done it. One, because in the lack of consensus in the definition and then integrating groups of animals. In Mexico, there is a regulatory framework as a part of different bodies of law for animal welfare, but there are lots of gaps. And we have been discussing the importance and the relevance of having a framework law for animal welfare. And this is a framework law, one that is guided by these concepts and goes around what WAH has been promoting. We are talking to senators and deputies. We have Diputado Gachus from Morena. He has the document and he might put it to the chamber at the forthcoming term. It includes many of these topics, and one of them has to do with the use of domestic animals, and this includes accompanying animals. So it is important to have this regulatory framework because this may result in secondary legislation to take care of specific problems for each of these groups of animals. But why is it important? Not only to cover animal welfare, but also having a law that will enable us to solve problems for production will allow us to have, and these animals, to have a more efficient production when it comes to research animals, quality research, and wild fauna in captivity. We need to make sure this fit conservation in the case of working animals, this has a direct effect in the communities working with them. And of course, having about responsible ownership, which is fundamental for dogs in this forum. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. And I'll be around for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Francisco Galindo, for your remarkable presentation. Let's see if there are any questions for Dr. Francisco Galindo. Right, so from the jurisdictional point of view, the lawyers who have been working to pass the law, they use it for the people responsible for the animal, for the care of the owner, but also could be someone in charge of a dog at a laboratory or somebody in charge of the dogs at the racing pit. Yes, Herman is asking if this will have some costs for people and whether or not it goes according to, well, does it seek to make money from dog owners? Is that your question? I will pass you the mic so that everyone can hear your question. Right. I mean to say that with the government, we're always looking at new things, just like owning an animal. Perhaps it could have a cost, just like there is a cost to have a car or anything else. And that is if it happens so, because this is what the government is thinking about. I think, first of all, they need to think about controlling dogs on the streets, stray dogs. I live in a town where there weren't any, and right now there are plenty of, and they are just ending with the fauna. And before starting to choke those, with that, maybe we can do as best as we can in breeding and contributing to feeding and taking care of a specimen. But just like we heard it years ago, would there have to be any costs to own a dog? Is it a law, or am I mistaken? But before that, I think they should concern themselves with, just like you said, dogs out there. What they eat, whatever's out there, because there is nothing else for them to eat. They should care about that instead of just punishing the people like all the governments have in this country. Well, yes, it does not contemplate these tax or additional cost. I know several countries in Europe do apply it, but no, this law does not include that. In fact, there have been studies about the budget for the implementation, and it doesn't include additional costs. The idea is to come up with a framework law with the principles of animal welfare already included in OMSA recommendations, so that it can allow for a more specific legislation per group of animals. But that, I'm sure, is that has to do with those more directly involved in companion animals. They need to discuss that. Another question over here. Let's hand the mic. Thank you, doctor. Congratulations on your talk. My question is, what happens with research animals? And I mean specifically cats. In other countries, there is a legislation and there is protection for these animals that are used for research. We have even taken it to other species such as the zebra fish for toxicological research in order not to have as much impact on companion animals. I would like to know what is being done when it comes to our country, because for me it is clear that in the European Union they are very orderly, they have very special laws which they abide by. What is going on here? Because colleagues are conducting research under petition of certain pharmaceutical labs, and I see that they don't follow any welfare principles, especially for cats, and I've seen that. Thank you. Right, so what this framework law aims to do in research animals, in the chapter of research animal, is to be based on the official Mexican rule. We have an official Mexican regulation. CONASA helped put it together more than 20 years ago, and the advantage of it being a norm is that it gets updated. There might be some voids there in regards to certain groups of animals used in research, but it does include dogs and cats. Besides the Mexican official norm, we have the creation of ethics committees at each researching institution using different groups of animals. These bioethics committees need to be plural. And this is something I can say about how this law aims to update the subject. I agree that OMSA worldwide has a chapter for animal welfare for research that is worth looking at more specifically in the local legislation. Doctor, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. But I would like to go deeper in just a few things about the legislation, and more specifically about Mexico. It's all really cool, everything we discuss and say about animal welfare, that's nice, but as long as we don't have a regulatory framework or a law that really establishes and enforces it, it will continue to be very complex to put it in practice, and of course, it can take a long time. My question is, while this takes place, what can we do in the meantime? I mean, those who are into dog breeding and care and all of that, how can we do something to make this animal welfare be actually reflected on the animals we work with daily? Because if we wait for legislators to come to an agreement to set up a regulatory framework, that could take so long. Thank you for your question. Of course, and I agree with you because, as I said, it's been more than 15 years trying to pass this law. Dr. Pashkin said it a while ago. For many years, he helped us push it at the Senate, lobby it at the Senate. Even though it seems like a weird subject, there are different interests and different postures and positions that can come into conflict. But it is useful, yes, to have a framework law for our animals and then have a secondary legislation. The advantage is that in this day and age we have so much information compared to 15, 20 years ago. And now, answering your question specifically, there is so much information available from many NGOs. I worked with IFAW, International Fund for Animal Welfare. They had an office in Mexico for Latin America. They have a program of welfare companion animals that is excellent. A lot of manuals posted online, and just like IFAO, we have many. I think NGOs in this vein have done a tremendous job when it comes to the spread of information and for the handling of dogs specifically. Some countries have a much more advanced agenda. The UK has a lot of information available, Larry's PCA, dog handling at refugees, at the kennels. There is enough information to start tackling these problems. And we just need to follow the recommendations issued. If it ends up being a successful regulatory framework, we can consider ourselves successful as well. Well, yeah, of course. I would like to emphasize that when you listen to something for so long, you realize you're one of the old professors and you miss how the change took place until you read it in a history book. But if there is someone who can talk about the law as a person is Francisco. He has been behind this for these many years, and the law could be drafted in such a way that it could be applicable in an objective and fair fashion tomorrow already, because he has the concept crystal clear. And should the chambers and the Congress act in a more rightful fashion, we would have it by now. This isn't because of a technical issue or because we don't know how. It is very well thought of. Take into consideration that the laws of animal welfare, and if you take into consideration the amount of egg, meat, and milk that we consume, those animals are contemplated within this law, and they need to have conditions, decent conditions of living, transportation, feeding, and all that. And for that, we need millions to do it well. We have a fund of contribution for animal welfare because we forget about all the animals without thinking that animals and human beings can evolve perfectly alongside together, but a society without animals could not. Human society, in fact, has advanced because of the contribution of animals. Just think about nutrition and feeding. And credit to whom credit is due. Pancho Galindo is a true specialist on animal and canine welfare. And this is my last comment, but I have the right to speak because I am old. I saw the evolution of this, of animal welfare. I want to point out another colleague, 𝐒𝐤𝐿. Because when I started with my pathology, animals were very poorly developed. There was a huge amount of nutritional problems. Crooked legs, big breeds grew up with deformities, and there was a fair share of obese animals because they would be fed whatever human beings would eat. The amount of salt we put in our food and in dog food is lethal. They can develop endocardiosis and heart insufficiency very quickly. So if somebody was behind this education to eat balanced feed, and the huge contribution to dog well-being was 𝐒𝐿. And with the synergy created, we have Royal Canin here. And for the welfare of the dog, that has been paramount. Now we have our pets living for longer with us and living well. And what I want to highlight from Pancho Galindo's talk is the action with kids. What's the current world like? It is but sheer violence. It is truly dehumanizing. It is barbaric what we see right now. Because very easily today somebody with arms crossed, they perform unbelievable atrocities and get to even bomb a country. But in this sense, an activity that comes from the heart, from love, this is what we do in our line of work. Spending time with dogs and with pets in general, but very particularly dogs, comes from deep-seated love. When you get home very tired, the first one to come say hello and wagging the tail is the dog, right? And this changes the whole situation, and the fact that kids can start participating in this at a very young age, the only thing we will have is a more sensitive society, less brutal, and I think that is a contribution of the canine activities, very important for human society and for dogs because of the relation with human beings. Thank you.
I want to thank the FCI board members for giving Mexico the opportunity of having this important World Congress for Welfare and Health for the dogs worldwide. We are really pleased and thank you so much for giving us this great opportunity. And also I want to thank all the speakers from all over the world who participate in this great event. Thank you.